Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take a complex topic, look at the shared materials, and really pull out the critical information, the insights you need to get up to speed fast. And today we're diving into something really quite important. Recent security alerts. These are impacting some, well, very widely used enterprise security products. It's going to be a deep dive into the nitty-gritty of these critical vulnerabilities. We're not just talking about what they are, but crucially, why they matter in the real world, and what they tell us about the, frankly, constant challenge of keeping digital systems safe.
Exactly. What we're exploring today, it really highlights a series of critical issues demanding urgent attention from organizations using these specific products. These aren't just theoretical risks. They're deeply technical flaws that could lead to pretty significant compromise, even if, and this is an important bit of context, even if they haven't yet been seen being widely exploited out there. Our goal today really is to help you understand these technical details and, maybe more importantly, connect them directly to the real-world implications for you, for your security posture.
Okay. Before we jump right in, just a quick word from our sponsor. This deep dive is brought to you by Stonefly. They're a leader in enterprise storage, backup, and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions. If you're looking for secure, maybe ransomware-proof storage, Stonefly sells air-gapped and immutable storage. You can contact sales at stonefly.com to schedule a demo. Okay, so let's unpack this. What specifically are we digging into today? Based on the information we've got, we're looking at information highlighting multiple critical vulnerabilities identified and patched in specific widely used enterprise security products. And these aren't just any products, right? They're part of the security stack many organizations rely on every single day.
That's right. We're examining security alerts concerning products from a major security vendor. The key focus areas are vulnerabilities impacting their Apex Central Management Console, also their Endpoint Encryption PolicyServer, and some related findings about Apex One, that's an endpoint security agent, often managed by Apex Central. And the reason these alerts are so significant, so concerning, is that these aren't, minor bugs or low-risk things. We're talking really serious flaws, really critical, with very high CVSS scores, some hitting 9.8 out of 10, and involving the most dangerous outcomes, things like remote code execution, authentication bypass, really serious stuff.
Okay, so our mission today is to kind of cut through the jargon, the stuff you see in security bulletins. We want to translate these findings into terms that are understandable and, well, actionable. What are the specific vulnerabilities? Why exactly are they so dangerous? And maybe what key lessons can we pull from these incidents about the broader challenges? And maybe the effective strategies in cybersecurity. It's about getting you informed quickly, thoroughly, and with just enough technical detail to really appreciate the risks involved and, the necessary responses.
Right. Let's start with the headline news from the information we have. Multiple critical and high-severity security vulnerabilities have been identified, and crucially, patches have been released for these key enterprise security products. These updates rolled out pretty recently, around June 10th and 12th of 2025. This involves updates specifically for Trend Micro Apex Central, Trend Micro Endpoint Encryption PolicyServer, and Trend Micro Apex One.
And the absolute key takeaway right off the bat is that patches are available for all of these. That's the immediate action item, isn't it, for any organization using them?
Yes, absolutely. That is the single most important piece of information for anyone running this software. Patches are out, they're available, the advisories are very clear. They describe the need for these updates to have immediate application, treat them with the highest priority, obviously after testing them first. For systems potentially vulnerable, patching is the #1 most effective mitigation, period.
Okay. Now, we see notes in the material saying these vulnerabilities aren't currently being seen actively exploited in the wild. Does that change the urgency? Does it mean maybe organizations can take a bit more time with these critical patches?
That's a really important question. And it's a point of context that, sometimes leads to confusion in cybersecurity. The fact that these vulnerabilities haven't been widely reported as exploited in real-world attacks yet, well, that's definitely positive news. It suggests there isn't, a massive ongoing campaign hitting these specific flaws right this second. However, and this is absolutely critical, it does not in any way reduce the vulnerability's critical rating or the extreme urgency of applying the patches. That critical rating, those near maximum CVSS scores like 9.8, that's extremely high. They're assigned based on the potential impact if exploited, and the ease with which an attacker could exploit them if they find them. They reflect the inherent severity of the flaw itself. Think of it like this: finding out there's a massive structural flaw in a building's foundation. That's critical news, even if the building hasn't actually collapsed yet.
Right, the potential is the problem.
Exactly. The critical rating means the potential for disaster is high, and fixing it immediately is crucial because you just don't know when someone might find that weak spot and try to exploit it. Once a critical vulnerability is publicly disclosed, like these have been, the clock starts ticking. Attackers start working to understand it. The window between patch release and active exploitation can be very, very short, sometimes just days, even hours for critical flaws. So proactive patching is really the only way to be sure you're protected before you become a target.
That analogy makes the urgency crystal clear. The potential is severe. Waiting is just asking for trouble. Okay, let's dive into specifics then, starting with Apex Central. What did we learn about the critical issues hitting this management product?
Okay, for Trend Micro Apex Central, the information points to two specific critical vulnerabilities, identified as CVE 2025-49219 and CVE 2025-49220. And as we mentioned, both of these are rated with that near maximum CVSS v3 score of 9.8, signaling just how severe they are.
A 9.8. Again, that's about as bad as it gets on that scale. What kind of vulnerability are we talking about technically?
Both of these critical flaws, they fall under the same technical umbrella. They're described as deserialization of untrusted data remote code execution vulnerabilities. Now, while they share that category and both affect Apex Central, they were actually found in different parts of the software's code, different methods apparently. One in Get Report Detail View, the other in Convert from JSON.
Deserialization of untrusted data RCE vulnerabilities.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
Right.
And it sounds pretty technical. Can you break that down for us? What does deserialization even mean in software? And why is doing it with untrusted data so dangerous that it leads to something like remote code execution? Absolutely. Let's unpack this. Drawing on the general info about insecure deserialization. Imagine you have a complex piece of data, or maybe a software object. Could be settings for a report, a user's profile, instructions for a task, you know. When software needs to save this object, maybe to a file or send it over the network, it often uses a process called serialization. It's like taking that complex object and flattening it out, converting it into a simple stream of bytes, easier to store or transmit that way.
Okay, like packaging it up.
Exactly. Then, deserialization is the reverse. When software gets that stream of bytes back, it takes it and rebuilds it back into the original, complex, functional object the program can work with. Now, the problem, and this is highlighted in the general info about these vulnerabilities, it arises when an application does this deserialization process on data it gets from an untrusted source, meaning data that comes from outside the application's direct control, maybe user input, maybe an external system connecting, maybe a file someone uploaded. If this incoming data hasn't been rigorously checked, validated, sanitized, and if the deserialization process itself isn't secure, an attacker can potentially manipulate that stream of bytes.
Ah, okay. So the attacker isn't injecting like traditional malicious code into a text box or something. They're actually crafting the data itself, the byte stream, before the software rebuilds it.
Precisely. They craft that byte stream maliciously. So when the application tries to deserialize it, instead of just getting back the simple object expected, say, that report configuration, the malicious data, tricks the deserialization process. It can make it perform unintended actions. And critically, as the general information notes, this often happens during the deserialization process itself, sometimes even before it's finished, which means any security checks performed after deserialization starts, often too late to stop the attack.
Wow, that's really sneaky, sophisticated. It's like hiding command inside what looks like perfectly normal data. The general materials also mention this is sometimes called object injection. Is that the same idea?
Exactly the same idea. It lets an attacker potentially force the application to create or instantiate an object of a totally different type, a different class, than the program was expecting. So the application might think it's deserializing a simple configuration object, but the attacker's malicious byte stream could trick it into creating something much more powerful, maybe even harmful, from the application's own code libraries and dependencies. This is where that concept of gadget chains comes in, mentioned in the context of insecure deserialization. Attackers can chain together existing legitimate code function stuff already inside the application using the malicious deserialized data. They make the app perform harmful actions using its own building blocks, turning the application against itself, essentially.
And with these specific Apex Central vulnerabilities, This whole deserialization mess leads directly to remote code execution, RCE. Why is RCE considered such a, well, catastrophic outcome?
Well, the general materials explain that RCE is arguably the most severe type of arbitrary code execution flaw because it lets an attacker run any code they want on a remote machine, usually over the network. It gives them complete control. And what makes these two apex central bugs, the 49219 and 49220, even more dangerous is that they are pre-authentication, RCE.
Pre-authentication. Okay, that sounds bad.
It's crucial. It means an attacker doesn't need a username, a password, any kind of valid access to exploit them. They just need to be able to reach the vulnerable service over the network. The potential impact of a successful pre-auth RCE, especially with a 9.8 CVSS, it's basically a full immediate compromise of that system. If they can run arbitrary code without logging in, they bypass everything else. Think about it. Steal data, deploy ransomware, set up persistent access, pivot deeper into the network, cause denial of service. The general RCE info lists all those possibilities: penetration, privilege escalation, data exposure, DOS, crypto mining, ransomware. A 9.8 score reflects that potential for complete takeover, no login required.
That's incredibly serious, especially since Apex Central is a management console, right? It probably holds keys to managing tons of endpoint agents across an organization. Which specific versions of Apex Central were hit by these two critical RCE flaws?
The bulletin specified both Apex Central 2019, that's the on-premise version, and also Apex Central as a service were affected. So for orgs using the on-prem Apex Central 2019, the fix is in critical patch B7007. For users of the SaaS version, the good news is the issues were apparently already addressed on the back end during the April 2025 maintenance cycle. So SaaS customers should already be protected by the vendor.
It's interesting. The advisories mention that exploiting these generally require that an attacker has access, physical or remote, to a vulnerable machine, but they still emphasize immediate updates. Why that distinction? Is network access not enough?
Yeah, that's an important nuance, but you're right, it doesn't really lessen the urgency. While mitigating factors like strong network segmentation, maybe putting the console behind firewalls, limiting external access, while those things can reduce the likelihood of an attacker reaching the vulnerable service, they aren't guarantees, especially if an attacker can reach it. A vulnerability with a 9.8 score means if an attacker can send that crafted malicious data to the vulnerable part, the technical difficulty of exploitation is very low. Minimal user interaction needed, no authentication. The attack is likely highly reliable once the input is delivered. So, yeah, network controls are good layers of defense, but patching the vulnerability itself is the most direct, the most certain way to eliminate the risk. The materials also mention specific network IPS rules are available from Trend Micro Tipping Point, Cloud One Network Security, Workload Security, Deep Security as proactive, secondary protection. They might help block attempts at the network level. Filter 35498 and Rule 10122375 specifically.
Okay. And these critical flaws, they were found and reported responsibly.
Yes, the materials explicitly credit the Zero-Day Initiative ZDI and specific researchers, Piotr Bezidlo and an anonymous researcher working with ZDI, for finding and reporting these, which is, a vital part of the security ecosystem. Researchers finding flaws, responsibly disclosing them to vendors that allows patches before the details get widely known and weaponized. It's a race, really.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears now. Another critical piece of security infrastructure got patches: the Trend Micro Endpoint Encryption PolicyServer. The materials suggest even more vulnerabilities were fixed here, including several critical ones.
That's right. The bulletin for the Trend Micro Endpoint Encryption, or TMEE, PolicyServer details a total of 8 distinct vulnerabilities, all resolved in this one patch cycle, and they range in severity from high right up to critical, with CVSS scores from 7.7 all the way up to that 9.8 again. The affected versions are noted as anything before 6.0.4013.
Endpoint encryption. That sounds particularly critical, especially for organizations dealing with sensitive data, right? What exactly does the PolicyServer do? Why is a flaw here such a big deal?
Oh, it's absolutely critical. The TME PolicyServer is the central brain for an organization's full disk encryption and removable media encryption. It's the hub that manages settings, potentially holds recovery keys, controls access to encrypted data, enforces policies across all the endpoints, laptops, desktops, USB drives. You see these deployed extensively in enterprises, especially regulated industries, finance, healthcare, legal, government. Places where protecting data confidentiality is just non-negotiable, legally and business-wise. So compromising the server that controls all that, it could be devastating. An attacker could potentially get encryption keys, disable encryption, mess with policies, access sensitive configurations, maybe even lead to widespread data exposure or lock people out of their systems.
Okay, 8 vulnerabilities fixed in one update, ranging from high to critical. What are the main types of vulnerabilities we're seeing listed here for the policy server?
It's a concerning mix, really. The 3 key categories highlighted in the details are: number 1, again, deserialization of untrusted data leading to RCE. Number 2, authentication bypass vulnerabilities. And number 3, SQL injection vulnerabilities leading to privilege escalation.
Let's start with deserialization again, since we just covered how bad that was with Apex Central. Similar story here.
Right. For the TMEE policy server, there are 4 distinct deserialization flaws listed in this bulletin. We've got CVE 2025, 49212, 49213, 49213, and 49213. And 49212. Now, 3 of these, the 49212, 49213, and 49213C, are rated critical, CVSS 9.8. And just like the Apex Central ones, they're described as pre-authentication RCE, stemming from insecure deserialization. The materials note that while the fundamental flaw is similar, these specific bugs are in different methods or components within the policy server itself. Things like the policy value table serialization binder class, policy server Windows service class, and the validate token method implementation are mentioned. The 4th deserialization bug here, CVE 2025-49212, is rated slightly lower but still high severity, CVSS 8.8. The key difference: this one's described as post-authentication RCE.
Post-authentication, meaning the attacker needs to already be logged in somehow.
Exactly. To exploit this one, an attacker would first need some level of authenticated access. The materials say specifically it requires the attacker to first get the ability to execute low-privileged code on the target system. So, still severe, RCE is always severe, but it has higher prerequisites than those 9.8 pre-auth ones.
That pre versus post-auth distinction really matters for immediate risk assessment, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Pre-auth is the open door. Post-auth means they're already inside.
Precisely. Pre-auth flaws are often what attackers look for first, for that initial way in. Post-auth flaws are more about what they do after they get a foothold, move around, gain more power.
Okay. And then there's an authentication bypass vulnerability listed. That sounds, well, pretty direct.
It is. About as direct as you can get. CVE 2025-4921C, also rated critical, CVSS 9.8, is specifically an authentication bypass. The materials say it's due to an improper implementation of an authentication algorithm found within a specific service of the policy server, the DDEP domain service.
So instead of needing complex data manipulation or finding a code execution flaw, an attacker could potentially just skip the login entirely, get administrative access right away.
That's exactly what authentication bypass means, yes. As described, this vulnerability could potentially let an attacker completely sidestep the normal login checks and gain access to key admin methods, key functionalities within the policy server. They could modify critical configurations, access sensitive features, manipulate policies, all without needing any valid credentials. The general information on unauthorized access really hammers this point home. Bypassing authentication is one of the most straightforward, high-impact ways attackers get into systems they shouldn't. And for a server managing encryption for potentially thousands of endpoints, gaining unauthorized high-privilege access right from the start like that, it's incredibly serious, like finding the master key, as you said.
Yeah, that's really alarming, just walking past the security guard in the system like that. Okay, what about the SQL injection vulnerabilities? There were 3 of those.
That's right. 3 distinct SQL injection vulnerabilities patched in this update for TMEE policy server. CVE 2025-49211, 49215, and 49218. 2 are rated high, CVFS 7.7. 1 is also high, but a bit higher score, 8.8. All 3 are specifically described as leading to privilege escalation. Now, as the definition of SQL injection explains, this happens when an attacker can inject malicious SQL code into input fields or parameters, things the application uses to talk to its backend database. If the application doesn't properly sanitize or validate that user input before sticking it into a database query, the database can be tricked into running the attacker's malicious code.
And in this case, that leads to privilege escalation. How does injecting SQL let someone get higher permissions?
Yes. By carefully crafting that malicious SQL code, an attacker can manipulate the database queries or responses. They might trick the application into granting them higher permissions than they should have. Maybe they modify their own user permissions stored in the database. Maybe they access data tables they shouldn't see. Maybe even gain admin control over parts of the application by messing with the backend database structure. Now, the materials do note that for these specific TME SQL injection bugs, similar to that 8.8 deserialization flaw, the attacker generally needs to first get the ability to execute low-privileged code on the target system. And one of them, CVE 2025-49215, the 8.8 one, is explicitly called out as post-authentication, meaning the attacker needs to be logged in already even with low privileges.
Okay, so maybe not the initial entry point like the pre-auth RCEs or the auth bypass, but still a very dangerous path for an attacker who's already got a foot in the door.
Yeah.
They can use these SQL flaws to seriously level up their access within the system, specifically by attacking that backend database controlling the policy server.
Exactly. Privilege escalation is a classic critical goal for attackers once they get that initial unauthorized access. The general materials on both unauthorized access and RCE mention privilege escalation as a key impact. It's how they go from just being in to actually controlling things and getting the sensitive data.
And the patch that fixes all 8 of these TME policy server issues is listed as Patch 1 Update 6, version 6.0.4013.
Correct. And again, just like with Apex Central, the materials strongly emphasize applying this update immediately. Treat it with the highest priority. And again, there are specific network IPS rules mentioned from Trend Micro's platforms, filters 45073 and 45072 for Tipping Point Cloud 1 as potential secondary protection to help block attempts against some of these flaws.
And credit again to security researchers, including Pewter Low from ZDI, for finding and reporting several of these issues. That responsible disclosure process seems crucial here.
Absolutely vital. Without researchers finding these and reporting them responsibly, these critical flaws might just sit there until attackers find them and exploit them widely, potentially causing massive damage before a fix is even ready.
Okay, so we've covered Apex Central, the endpoint encryption policy server, but we also have info referencing critical patches for Trend Micro Apex 1. How does that fit into this picture?
Right. This adds another important layer to these recent alerts. Now, Apex One is a separate product from Apex Central, though. As we said, Apex Central is often used to manage the Apex One agents deployed on endpoints. Apex One is the actual endpoint security product itself, the agent software running on individual computers doing the protection. And the materials indicate that Apex One also received critical patches addressing 5 high-severity vulnerabilities released right around the same time, June 9th and 12th. The most severe of these Apex One flaws is CVE 2025-49155. It's got a CVSS of 8.8, and it allows remote code execution specifically through the data loss prevention, or DLP, module of Apex One. This one's particularly interesting because the materials state that, unlike many others we've discussed, it apparently doesn't require authentication or high privileges on the endpoint itself. It just requires minimal user interaction to be potentially exploited.
Minimal user interaction. So unlike needing system access already, this one could potentially be triggered just by, say, user opening a specific file or clicking something that gets processed by the DLP module on their machine.
That's what the description suggests, yes. It says it requires only user interaction rather than prior system access, meaning the attacker might need to trick a user into doing something specific, opening a malicious document, maybe downloading a crafted file that triggers the vulnerable code path inside the DLP module. This stems from a different kind of technical weakness. Again, it's described as an uncontrolled search path element. Basically, the software looks for resources or code in a way an attacker can manipulate. They might trick it into running malicious code they place somewhere predictable instead of the legitimate code it was supposed to run. But the end result is still that highly dangerous outcome, RCE. The other 4 Apex One vulnerabilities listed include an insecure access control issue, that's CVE 2025-49154, CVSS 8.7, which could let attackers overwrite memory map files. And then there are 3 local privilege escalation vulnerabilities, CVE 2025-49156, 49157, and -49158. With CVSS scores ranging from 6.7 to 7.8. For most of these other Apex One flaws, the materials indicate an attacker would already need the ability to execute low-privileged code on that specific endpoint before they could exploit them to escalate privileges or cause other harm.
Okay, so looking across these different but related products, Apex Central, the encryption policy server, Apex One, we're definitely seeing a pattern, aren't we? Critical or high-severity flaws involving the most dangerous attack types, RCE, auth bypass, privilege escalation, and these outcomes are enabled by a whole range of underlying technical weaknesses, from insecure data handling like deserialization, flawed authentication logic, classic SQL injection, even issues with how software finds files.
Precisely. It paints a very clear picture. The ongoing, multifaceted challenge of securing complex enterprise software, especially security software itself, which is, ironically, often a prime target. It really underscores how critical it is to address fundamental weaknesses in software development. Things like proper input validation, secure deserialization practices, robust authentication logic, secure handling of file paths, because these are the root causes attackers relentlessly probe and exploit.
So bringing this all together, well, what does this really mean for someone just trying to stay informed? Or maybe for an organization actually responsible for securing their systems? What are the key takeaways here beyond just knowing about these specific patches?
Yeah, this is where it gets, I think, really interesting because these specific security alerts, these critical vulnerabilities in widely used security products, they're not just isolated incidents. They're
Mhm.
really concrete, high-profile examples illustrating some of those pervasive and dangerous threats organizations face today. The general information we have on concepts like RCE and secure deserialization, SQL injection, unauthorized access, that provides the essential context for understanding why finding these specific bugs in critical security infrastructure is such a big deal, why it warrants these high alert levels. For instance, those multiple deserialization flaws in Apex Central and TME PolicyServer, they're powerful examples of how a seemingly internal software process just rebuilding data into an object can be weaponized if it's not handled securely, especially when that data comes from outside. And that gadget chain concept, while technical, it highlights a key point. Attackers exploiting insecure deserialization often don't even need to write new malicious code. They find ways to chain together existing legitimate functions already inside the application just by manipulating the data being deserialized, using the software's own tools against itself.
Right. And the SQL injection issues, especially the ones leading to privilege escalation in the TMEE policy server. They're a stark reminder, aren't they, that fundamental input validation problems, stuff we've known about for decades, can still give attackers deep access into back-end databases controlling critical systems.
Yeah.
Shows that old vulnerabilities are still very much alive if developers aren't careful.
Exactly. While these might not be brand new types of attacks from a theoretical view, finding them in critical security infrastructure endpoint management consoles, encryption policy servers is particularly alarming. These products are inherently high-value targets. Compromising them can grant broad access across an entire organization or control over vital security functions like data protection. They really are the keys to the kingdom in many setups. Finding severe, easily exploitable flaws in them is a huge potential risk.
And the general information on unauthorized access seems to tie it all together. That's the ultimate goal, right? Whether it's through pre-auth RCE for instant root or auth bypass to skip login, or privilege escalation via SQL after getting a foothold, all these vulnerabilities are just different paths for an attacker to get that unauthorized access. And unauthorized access is consistently pointed to as the root cause of most big breaches, data theft, ransomware attacks.
Right. The potential immediate risks from unauthorized access listed in the general materials, stealing data, deploying ransomware, compromising systems for later attacks, causing disruption, they map directly onto the possible outcomes if these critical vulnerabilities and security products were successfully exploited in a targeted attack.
So, okay, beyond just knowing these specific trend micropatches exist and need applying, what are the bigger overarching takeaways? For organizations, for security pros trying to defend against these kinds of attacks in general, what do the materials suggest are the best preventative measures?
Well, the overarching theme that really comes through from the preventative measures discussed. It's the absolute necessity of defense in depth and rigorous security hygiene at multiple levels. For software developers, the strong recommendation is avoid deserializing untrusted input if you possibly can. If you have to, use extremely secure coding standards, use libraries designed to prevent these issues, specifically stopping unintended objects from being created. And rigorous input validation everywhere, always to block injection attacks like SQL. Using tools like web application firewalls, network IPS, they can provide a crucial extra layer, maybe catching exploit attempts even before they hit the application. But for organizations using these products, the single most immediate, paramount takeaway from these alerts is timely patching, period. As the bulletins repeat, even if exploits aren't seen yet, the documented potential for severe impact, especially those 9.8 CVSS pre-auth flaws, means the window to patch before exploitation starts is incredibly narrow. Delaying could be catastrophic.
So patching is number one for the immediate threat. What else?
Beyond patching, the materials emphasize robust access controls within the network. Things like network segmentation, making it harder for an attacker to even reach these critical servers in the first place, limiting external exposure, maybe implementing zero trust principles to limit lateral movement even if they do get an initial foothold. Secure memory management for developers, where relevant, continuously inspecting network traffic for suspicious patterns, and from the broader unauthorized access discussion, Strengthening authentication everywhere, especially for admin interfaces. Multi-factor authentication, MFA, is key. Plus, robust security monitoring to detect suspicious user activity, weird login attempts, catching potential breaches early.
It definitely reinforces that security isn't a one-and-done thing, is it? It's continuous, multi-layered. Patching fixes these specific bugs. But the types of bugs, deserialization, off-bypass, SQL and path issues, they highlight the ongoing need for vigilance in coding, network defense, access management, especially for critical systems.
That's exactly the core lesson here. Security is a constant process, people, process, technology. Understanding the technical nature of these specific flaws. How deserialization can lead to code execution, how auth logic can be bypassed, how input validation failures lead to privilege escalation. That helps security teams not just apply patches, but understand why things like rigorous input handling, careful design, and prompt updates are absolutely non-negotiable, especially in today's threat landscape.
So we've taken a deep dive today into these recent critical security patches affecting widely used enterprise security products. We look at the flaws ranging from remote code execution via insecure deserialization and other methods, right through to authentication bypass and SQL injection leading to privilege escalation. We've really explored how these technical flaws can open dangerous doors for unauthorized access, potentially leading to severe consequences like data breaches, system compromise, major disruption.
And we've reinforced that crucial message drawn straight from the advisories and general security principles. Even when vulnerabilities aren't actively exploited yet, their potential severity, especially those critical ones, demands immediate patching. And that needs to be coupled with a proactive, layered approach to security hygiene across the whole organization, all informed by really understanding the underlying attack vectors and their potential impact.
It's definitely a complex landscape out there, particularly at the enterprise scale. But understanding these details, their real-world implications, it's absolutely key to navigating it effectively, staying secure against determined attackers. This deep dive has been brought to you by Stonefly, a leader in enterprise storage, backup, and disaster recovery, and AI storage and cloud solutions. Remember, if you're looking for secure, ransomware-proof storage, Stonefly sells air-gapped and immutable storage. You can contact sales@stonefly.com to schedule a demo.
Thank you for joining us for this look into critical software vulnerabilities, particularly in security products, and what they really mean for organizational defense.
And as you think about these issues, the complexity of software, this constant hunt for flaws, the fact that even the tools designed to protect us can have severe vulnerabilities, here's a final thought to leave you with. Given how often critical vulnerabilities are discovered, even in highly tested security software, what does that really tell us about the inherent difficulty of writing truly secure code at scale? And how does it underscore this perpetual high-stakes cat-and-mouse game between defenders striving for perfect resilience and attackers constantly seeking unauthorized access through any available weakness? It's a challenge demanding constant vigilance from everyone. Join us next time for another deep dive.